Hello and welcome. This weekend we begin, although technically it started on Wednesday of this past week, Ash Wednesday, the special season of Lent. And the readings for the first Sunday of Lent, the Gospel always remembers an account of Jesus so-called being tested or tempted. But the readings themselves, so we will come to reflect a little bit on particularly the first and the gospel today. First reading comes from the book of Genesis, from chapter 2. We'll choose verses 7 through 9, and then chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. The second reading comes from the letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 5, verses 12 through 19. Again, we will see that the Roman letter frequently is used to kind of help illustrate some aspect of the celebration that we are observing that week. And finally, the gospel from Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. So let us begin with the gospel story. It begins by saying that Jesus is led to be tempted. Now, there is, of course, a discussion as to whether or not the right word is tempted or tested. Reason I say that is, and we may have noticed this earlier on when we looked last year at the first Sunday, that in the ancient world, that is, would be the world in which Jesus grew up, the Mediterranean world, when compliments of high praise were given to someone, and that's important to notice that this episode follows immediately the baptism of Jesus by John in the Jordan, in which the famous theophany, appearance of God, it said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Well, now, the audience, hearing that Jesus is the one chosen by God, in whom he is well pleased, prove it. So there was a kind of sense, we don't just take that high praise without some kind of, and here's where the word testing perhaps is a little bit better than tempted, okay? And we have noticed before that the tempter here, and Matthew calls him the devil, but the tempter's original role, the Satan, had been, that is, a prosecutor. He had appeared first in the book of Job as the one whom God had pointed out to him how faithful and loyal Job was, and that Satan, therefore, had kind of raised the questions, how do we know that Job is really so faithful? So here, Satan is more an activator as an adversary than as an accuser. And this can easily be seen because the figure is more maligned. Now, the word diabolos, that is devil, would be a word that was important in the first century, in which, and it is perhaps important to notice, that by this time some of the so-called Hellenic influence had affected both the ways in which gospel thinking took place, but also the way in which Christians generally thought. Namely, the Hellenic idea had suggested that there were two forces in the world, the force of good and the force of evil. So if the force of good belongs to God, then we need some kind of personality that represents the force of evil, and thus emerges the idea of the devil. So this is called dualism. We know that it plays a very strong part in the development of Christian thought and in Christian belief. Keep in mind also here that the devil is a figure distinguished from a demon. We've mentioned before, and there's a tendency to equate, well, demon and devil, aren't they the same? No, they represented very different realities. Here, the devil represents Satan, the tempter, the prosecutor. Demons represented evil, the evil of illness, of sickness. And we've discussed this before, and perhaps, again, important to keep this in mind. So, if Jesus is truly the beloved of God, how do we test him? And the way in which Matthew phrases this is to use the testing of Israel in its years of wandering in the wilderness again, as a background for understanding the testing of Jesus. So we will see, as did Luke, that Matthew pictures three different tests being given to Jesus to see whether or not he really fulfills the role to which he apparently has been called by God. Now, one remembers that the years of testing in Israel's history had been 40 years in the wilderness. They had been wandering there. So this begins by saying that Jesus was 40 days in the desert, in the wilderness, as his tests begin. So we begin to see right away the parallelism that is being put in place. Now, the three tests all come from, as Jewish background, Hebrew background, from the fifth book of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy. And so to check them out, we'll reflect a little bit quickly on it. One, the first test has to do with bread, which of course is the staff of life. The second test has to do with where you put your trust. You must not put the Lord your God to the test. So that's going to be the second idea that Deuteronomy mentions. And third, worship belongs to God alone. All right, so with those in mind, how does this flesh out? Well, the first test is, if Jesus is really such a wonderful advocate in favor of God, and that's his mission, is it not perhaps a mission of social reform? That is, he should work as a popular leader for the reduction of hunger and poverty. And so change these stones into bread. We've heard these before, and you will simply quickly notice them. If you change the stones into bread, wouldn't that be feeding the many, and wouldn't that really be carrying out the mission that we believe the beloved of God should do? Jesus, however, rejoins, and notice that the rejoining that Jesus gives to the tester is that it is not by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And it's important to notice that as Israel had failed in each of its tests, its first test had been, remember, claiming, Lord God, we don't have enough to eat, and God rather had given them manna. So they had failed the test. Jesus passes the test. So again, that very important kind of parallelism or contrast that goes on. The second test tracks upon the Messiah's relationship with God. To achieve a reputation as a wonder worker, to get attention of people, isn't that important? This is what you must do. So throw down yourself and you'll be, Jesus then remarks to the adversary, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. This is about testing, but it's not about our testing or my testing God, but rather the reverse would be the case. Israel had failed again this time. It had tested God. If you really are caring for us, this is what you should be doing, see? So it's a reversal of approaches here. That's important. The third test would be a compromise with evil. It would recognize the devil's dominion to a point of regarding some people in some situations as beyond the hope of redemption. So the devil, or the advocate here, says, if you bow down, I will give all that you need, the whole world, to yours. And the response that, of course, Jesus gives is that worship belongs to God alone. Now, there is a slight little difference in the arrangement here. The first one in Luke stays the same. The second, however, and Matthew, we're not sure who is the original here, Matthew or Luke, but the second test brings Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple, to a high place. Now, there's a clever littleness here. Pinnacle may be referring to Psalm 91. Very often, by the way, the biblical writer Matthew refers to or uses literature that certainly every Israelite and most early Christians would be familiar with. And so Psalm 91 says that he will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. So that's what that whole idea of pentacle. Was it a place in the temple where this particular shelter of God would be recognized? Therefore, some point in the temple. And Jesus, as we heard, rebukes this. Then, and you can see the kind of gradation here: bread, stones, pentacle, building, now the whole world. So takes him again to a high mountain. Matthew is very familiar with using mountains because this, of course, is one of the places where God often is chosen, where God chooses to reveal things. And so here, in this high place, now whether or not from this mountain one could see the whole world, as the tempter suggests, again, maybe a bit of hyperbole, right? And we notice that that's a way in which things happen. Moses, of course, had been given the opportunity. Remember that he was not allowed to enter the Holy Land, but he was taken to a high mountain. Tradition suggests that it is Mount Nebo, Nebo, which is in the Jordan. And from that mountain, even today, on a clear day, one can get a nice picture of the Jordan Valley and of the whole of Israel. So Moses got a picture of the Promised Land. The advocate for the devil here says to Jesus, you will get not only the whole Promised Land, but the whole world. Now, whether there's any mountain in which you could see that amount, no. But what Jesus is being asked to do is to pay homage to Satan. And therefore, he rebukes him. So as we can see, Jesus, and this might well be called, this little episode, the testing of God's Son, passes with, we would say, high colors, okay? Now, in conclusion to this little section, remembering that Jesus is therefore the faithful and obedient Son of God, and as he is the obedient Son and Israel was the disobedient son, all things now work to showing truly and revealing that Jesus is worthy of the praise that God gave him. This is my beloved Son. I'm pleased. And of course, the next advice is listen to him. And this nicely preludes the whole mission of Jesus to be proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom. Now, whether or not the world is in the demonic power is an assumption that is made because of our dualistic thinking. And there would be, and still is, a kind of clash between the dualism of Hellenism, which Christian thinking very much embraces for a number of our teachings, and the Hebraic notion that there is only a unity and not this division is an ongoing discussion that somewhat takes place in the church today. Now, I'd like to go to the opening reading. Let me begin by the conclusion. The reading is chosen from Genesis because of a test. And a test is given to the first man and woman, and they, of course, failed the test. They are disobedient. And therefore, if Jesus is obedient, as Israel was disobedient, so this, I suggest that that's why this story of Genesis is very well known. And I thought we could spend a few moments here reflecting on this episode. What is the episode? The episode is the story of the creation of the world by God, and it is found in chapter 2. There are 2 creation stories, you remember, but this is the earlier one. This is the one in which God is pictured as looking at the chaos and creating a garden. Now, the garden, and everyone tries to find out where it is, and the garden story is not necessarily original, but it is certainly a story that the ancient Hebrew writer uses as illustrating how the world came to be. When God creates this garden, and some of these things are mentioned in the reading that we will hear, some of them are left out for all kinds of reasons, but basically because they don't help develop the basic idea of a test. This garden was surrounded by 4 rivers. So you see the garden has a great future because it will always be watered, and the only thing that God now needs is someone to take care of the garden. And so God is pictured as creating here a man. Now, the word Adam means man. By the way, it in lowercase simply means man. And we may have pointed out before, as long as it stays lowercase, it's simply a human being, a man. Now, it is true that the gender here seems to be male, although, and there's much discussion about this, I probably pointed this out, that this section of Genesis has gotten a lot of commentary from all kinds of scholars, both in the Judaic and the Christian world. And so there are a variety of interpretations here that are important to notice. And some of the more recent ones, I think, are insightful into what they might suggest for us. So God tells man, this is yours to take care of. All the trees are yours, all the vegetation is yours. There are only 2 trees which you are to avoid, namely the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You are not to eat the fruit, whatever it is, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the command to give is given here, please notice, to a man. At this point in the story, there is no woman. Now here is where thinkers come in. What is the problem that the man has? Some interpreters say it is solitude. Man does not feel comfortable alone and desires, therefore, a helper as his partner. And it is at this point that God now recognizes this need in this creation that he has given. Now, what is left out is that God then goes through a series of attempts to find, quote, unquote, a suitable partner, not a slave, not a servant, but a partner for taking care of the garden. And he runs by man a number of possible suitable partners, which turn out to be various different animals, okay? So the whole animal world is brought before the man, as well as apparently flying things too. And each time a man says, no, that apparently this does not work, does not seem to satisfy his need, And you can just imagine, well, what do you think about this one, man? Oh, well, Lord, I like its colors, yellow and black stripes, but those, would you like to wake up in the morning with the growling teeth coming at you? You don't like that? No. What shall we call it? Well, let us call it lion. So you see, you can kind of picture that not only are possibilities brought before the man, but also man is given the opportunity to name. So finally, the animals. So finally, God, and it's an interesting story, I think we've mentioned it before, but kind of frustrated that he can't seem to get anything that suitably fits man, casts him into a deep sleep. You know, sometimes we have said that. Notice if problems are going in the day, maybe if you should go to bed, when you wake up in the morning, you'll get a different view and maybe a fresh start on things. Now, what is pictured is God reaches into the center of the person. Now, here's where, interestingly, discussions take place. Some suggest that rather than calling the man, call him the human, and that as God reaches into the center of the human, takes out part of it, separates it, but that in the beginning, God had created fully the totality of humanity. Well, that's one viewpoint. Another says that God reaches not to the head or to the foot, but to the center of man. The Hebrew word here is rib. That can be understood in a number of different ways, both as a center part of the human, but also ribbing, a little bit of smile, a little bit of joke. And it pictures that God's creation now is different from the first, and you can smile and say, and different interpreters say that as God recreates the human being, first, second shapes and all of that, and the sleeping man, again, these parts are missing, unfortunately, I think, in this great story, but as the sleeping man awaits, he said, wow, what calls this woman, and thus finds a suitable partner. All right, so all of that is important to notice, that the prohibition against eating from one of those trees is not given to the woman, but has been given to the man. So, some interesting questions here is, why now we have a talking serpent, okay, or a snake. Again, these mythological characters, we in our own time, as we've noticed a number of times, are familiar because of cartooning of animals that can speak, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, etc. And so we're certainly aware in our culture that those things are possibility. However, think about it in the ancient world, wow, and so it catches our attention. Why does the tempter, the talking serpent, speak only to focus only on the woman? And questions that we can kind of raise here, I think these are interesting. How did she learn about the commandment? Why did the serpent misrepresent the commandment? What prompted the woman similarly to misrepresent the command by expanding it? Remember, and she says, we can't eat any of it or even to touch it. Now, that wasn't part of the original command that God had given to the man. And why is the husband, assuming that that is who the man's role is, silent during her conversation with the serpent? I mean, is the serpent and the woman somewhere way off there and the man is somewhere else? Hard to kind of imagine, right, as we look at this kind of garden. So all of this is that, and we are well aware, of course, of this story, is that the serpent says, well, and notice that the serpent gives half-truths. The value, rather, of a good lie is that there is some truth to it. Otherwise, you'd never believe it at all, would you? But what the lie is that it's a half-truth. Part of it is certainly the case, but not the consequences or the rest of it that ought to be also given. So, and here we might say, why does the man acquiesce to his partner when she offers him the fruit without raising any caution or objection? So, what of course we see happens here is both creatures disobey God's command, and they must pay the penalty of death. Now, death here, and different interpreters have kind of run this one in a little different way, is not referring to necessarily physical death, but it is a kind of death in which the relationship between the Creator and the humans is no longer honorable. And see, and we've noticed so often this question of honor and shame. And so what has happened now is, in disobeying the command of the divine, the humans notice that they are naked. So shame enters in to the story. God then is pictured in the shortness of this famous story, drives them out of the Garden of Eden, lest, and the question that is raised in the text, lest if he does not do this, the humans will then eat of the fruit of the other tree, the tree of life or immortality. Now, we might say, why did God forbid that they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and bad? Well, did God, and here are different viewpoints that are offered, did God desire to withhold ethical knowledge from humanity and make them dependent only on the commandments? That's one of the theories. Or God desired humanity to remain without knowledge of sexuality, pleasure, pain, life, or death. Is that what God's original intent had been? Or another viewpoint, God commanded humanity and did not want them to try to gain universal knowledge. Therefore, all knowledge should rest with the divine, did not want humanity to try to get that. Or was this, and here's a fourth viewpoint, so these are different viewpoints as to why God offered this, it was purely arbitrary, just so that humanity would realize that they were subject to divine command and not free to act at will. So all of those are possible reasons for why God ordered this. Now, I want to quickly summarize the fact that later on, men like St. Augustine will historicalize this, will take the name of man, Adam, capitalize it and make him a person, and develop the theory of original sin, which of course tends to be part of our tradition. Now, we need to discuss that in another way, but here, interestingly, the word sin is not brought in at this point. Sin comes in only with the following story of Cain and Abel. So, what does this little section of Genesis help us understand? So here are some interesting questions that people have raised. Why do snakes not have legs? Because God says you'll kind of grovel on the earth. Why do people fear snakes? Why does childbirth hurt? Why is there sexual desire? Why do men dominate women? Why is work so burdensome? Why do people die? So in some ways, this whole little section of Genesis probes those questions. But it's important to see as we conclude here, humans are not cursed by God, but rather they have chosen to fail the test. And I take a moment here, maybe a little bit longer here, that's another contemporary writer has this new approach, that Eve is not the cause of original sin, but is rather a brave and innovator active who, unlike her passive husband, was willing to dare to view new things and to bring us into a world of new opportunities and results. What if you took the whole Genesis story and looked at it that way, places the woman in a really marvelously different way? Well, that's it for now. Hope to see you again. Have a good week as we begin the Lenten time.